Today I have for you something that I know many of you enjoy seeing, and that is Hans Niemann getting taken down with a brutal checkmating, executed not by someone like Magnus or Hikaru, as is usually the case in my Hans Niemann videos, but this time it's by a mere 12-year-old child. But it's not just any 12-year-old, this is the record-setting Turkish prodigy Yağız Kaan Erdoğmuş, who now at age 13 holds the record of becoming the youngest 2600 FIDE rated player in history, a record which he set back in August of this year. This kid could very well be a future world champion. I'd put my money on him getting the title before Hans ever does, but let's get into this game. It's a 3-minute online blitz encounter from February of this year. Hans Niemann has the white pieces and opens with e4. Yağız responds e6, the French defense, at which point Hans decides to put his young opponent's knowledge of rare opening sidelines to the test with the move queen to e2. A very odd looking move, but this variation has a name, the Chigorin attack, since this is the opening move that everyone used to attack Chigorin with. Either that or it's the opening Chigorin used to attack everyone else with, I can't remember, but it's a weird looking move to be sure, developing the queen on move 2, blocking the light squared bishop, but it's actually more playable than it looks, since white will often go into a King's Indian attack with g3 and bishop to g2, when the white queen is actually pretty well placed on e2. Additionally, it sort of discourages an immediate d5 from black, at least it's supposed to, but Yağız, undeterred, goes ahead with his d5, which in the French is almost always played on move 2 by black. But in this position, after e takes d5 from Hans, because of the pin on the e-pawn, Yağız must now recapture with the queen, which is not ideal since Hans is now able to develop his knight to c3 with tempo on the black queen, giving white a small but significant edge, which kind of makes me wonder if the move d5 was pre-moved, but okay, the queen is under attack, and Yağız, apparently now forgetting that this isn't the Scandinavian defense, drops her back to her original square. And if white were to now continue with a move conducive to piece development, like knight to f3, he would enjoy a moderate advantage. But instead of going for a big lead in development, Hans chose to keep his small lead in development and add to his position's list of accolades a little increase in central control with the move f4, which pretty much brings the position back to utter equality. So I don't really know what to say about this move. Okay, it controls e5, maybe you can push f5 someday, but it just doesn't do enough. And it weakens white's kingside a little bit. So here, Yağız should take the opportunity to catch up in development with knight to c6 or knight to f6, but he kind of goes for the queenside version of what Hans did over here on the kingside with his next move c5, controlling a central square, which isn't a bad thing, but this kind of move is usually more effective when you're not too tempi behind in piece development. Now here the engine is getting a little excited, saying that white should play b3, bishop to b2, with the idea of castling queenside and then launching the pawn storm on black's kingside once he castles there. But Hans's move, knight to f3, is also very good, and it's the move that is statistically least likely to be a blunder no matter what opening you're playing. Actually, I just made that up, but it does kind of seem true. So always play knight to f3. Okay, so we now start to see some engine moves. We have knight to c6 from Yağız, best move in the position, and here the engine is still suggesting b3 for white, but Hans goes for g3, which gives black an interesting opportunity with the move knight to d4. Not played by Yağız, but it's a move that black can only get away with because of the fact that after knight takes d4, c takes d4 comes with tempo on white's knight, whose only really good square is going to be on e4, but after bishop to d7, bishop to g2, and bishop to c6, black's bishop is the first to arrive on the long diagonal, unimpeded by his own pieces, and ready to trade itself off for white's best good minor piece on g2. So that's an interesting line. Black might be slightly better, but in the game, the move is knight to f6. We have bishop to g2, naturally, bishop to e7, both players castle, d3 from Hans, opening a diagonal for his dark squared bishop, adding defense to c2 with the queen, which could be significant if black plays knight to d4, when maybe white doesn't want to capture there. Maybe he'll play something like queen to f2 instead, but we don't have knight to d4 quite yet. First comes a well-calculated b6, just inviting knight to e5 from Hans, which looks highly nasty, hitting the knight on c6 twice with the pin to the rook on a8. And this would just be the end of the road for black if he did not now have knight to d4 with an attack on the white queen, which must move. Hans puts her on f2. The rook is able to get out of danger with rook to b8. And for a brief moment, we have a state of peaceful equilibrium. Everyone is happy, but it's not to last. Hans now decides to get nutty with the move g4. He's decided he wants more control over the e4 square, and he's gonna get it. He's of course planning g5, kicking the knight off of f6, which is a controller of the e4 square. Now best for black is to just front run that idea with knight to d7, looking for knight takes e5, followed by f5. That would be good for black. There's also the possibility now of bishop to h4, which would be irritating for white. And it's going to be challenging for white to make the case that he hasn't just overextended these pawns. Now there is knight to c6 with the fork, forcing black to play knight takes c6, and after bishop takes c6, black has this very nice move b5, sacking this pawn in order to lure white's bishop off of the long diagonal, where black wants to put his bishop bearing down on the white king side, and then with the help of bishop to h4, white can potentially get caught in a very unpleasant crossfire. So that's a nice line, but in the game, we have bishop to b7. Hans pushes g5 as planned. Again, knight to d7 is good, maybe best, but Yağız's move, knight to d5, is very good as well, supported by the bishop, after which the only good move for white is going to be knight takes d5. And with best play from both sides, the game should continue bishop takes d5, bishop to e4, targeting that h7 pawn with a potential sacrifice in the air. For example, if black plays f6, then bishop takes on h7 is a forced mate in 6. Work that one out on your own if you'd like. Now black can play bishop takes e4, but then d takes e4 gives white another central pawn to work with, so that's not best for black. But we don't see this in the game, because Hans is committed to his move knight to e4, which looks fairly reasonable. And it's kind of interesting to see all 4 of these central squares occupied by knights. But in this position, white is actually already losing after Yağız's next move, f6. When we begin to see the repercussions of white having overextended his kingside pawns. The knight on e5 is attacked. You don't really want to move it and allow black to capture on g5, since that will uncover a pin on the f pawn. There will be no recapture unless you want to lose your queen. So Hans plays the best move here, g takes f6. We have bishop takes f6. It's the best reply, threatening to win a piece with bishop takes e5. Since again, white's f-pawn would be pinned to the queen, no recapture possible. So Hans removes the bishop with knight takes f6, to which Yağız responds with a very natural move, rook takes f6. Though it's not the strongest. G takes f6 would actually have been better, attacking the knight again on e5, and once it moves, let's say to f3, black has king to h8 with rook to g8 on the way, setting up some serious threats, up to and including a rook sacrifice on g2. And it doesn't take much imagination to see how this can quickly go south for white, after the black knight moves from d5, opening up the deadly diagonal for this lurking sniper here on b7. There's also knight to b4 to worry about. So this variation was best for black, but the move played by Yağız, rook takes f6, also heavily favors black. Is it winning by force? I don't really know, but it does come with a threat, which requires some very careful play from white, as in, he's only got one move. Pause the video if you'd like to take a moment or two and try to find it, but here it is. White's only move to keep him in the game, played by Hans Niemann, is c3. It's absolutely essential to challenge that knight on d4. And before I show you why, I'd like to invite you to try to find a beautiful tactic that Yağız now executes in this position. Pause the video and give it a shot, but here it comes. The move is knight takes f4, winning a pawn. But before we go any further, I want to show you a move that demonstrates why c3 was important. If the pawn were still on c2 and it were black's turn to move, then rook takes f4 would be totally crushing. Since after bishop takes f4 and knight takes f4, the bishop on g2 is hit with 2 pieces. And incredibly, white has not a thing he can do about it. Moving that bishop anywhere will lose the queen to knight to h3 check with the fork. Taking the knight on f4 will lose the queen to knight to e2 check with the fork. which is why it's essential to have the pawn on c3 and thus be able to play c takes d4 here, which would actually give white the winning position. So at what point Hans saw this idea of the piece sack on f4, I don't know, but he did find the best move to address it with c3, which in the game still allows Yağız to take on f4, but he's got to do it with the knight, to which Hans responds, bishop takes f4, it is the best move, and now here comes rook takes f4, hitting the white queen, who may not capture the rook, of course, lest she be lost to knight to e2 with the check and the fork. So very impressive board vision coming from the 12-year-old Yağız Erdoğmuş to spot this tactical resource in a 3-minute blitz game, allowing him to win a pawn. And as obvious as these combinations always look once you see them, being able to recognize that such an opportunity is present during the frantic fog of blitz, well, that is quite another matter. Hans, realizing that the rook on f4 is off limits, retreats his queen to the only good square, d2, where she's not going to be attacked, and she's keeping an eye on e2 and c2, where the black knight could potentially infiltrate. We have rook takes f1 check, rook takes f1, and now knight to f5 from Yağız, who emerges with his healthy extra pawn, for which white doesn't really have any compensation. Black's e6 pawn is a bit weak, but then again so is d3. So play continues, bishop takes b7, rook takes b7, queen to f4, and queen to f6, getting the queen a bit more active. Queen to d5 may have been a bit stronger, eyeing some pawns, and the knight, and this diagonal toward the white king. But Hans responds rook to f2. It is a good move, but perhaps not for the reason that Hans thinks it is, as we'll soon see. And from Yağız, we now get a bit of an odd move, rook to e7. Which took me a hot minute to figure out just what its purpose is until I realized that it's actually the safest way to get the rook to this half-opened d-file. He's planning rook to e8 and then rook to d8. So this is the best way to get there. Rook to b8 wouldn't have worked since it runs into the knight fork on d7. Rook to c7 was actually playable as well, but who wants to walk into the potential discovered attack by the white queen? Nobody. So rook to e7 is a very understandable decision, and the engine approves as well. We have a4 now from Hans, just restricting the black pawns a bit. We have rook to e8, at which point Hans plays an inaccurate move. He plays rook to g2, which looks like the most natural move in the world, opposite the black king, but better would have been knight to c6, preventing Yağız from getting his rook to d8 next, or if you want to go full engine mode, you got to play king to f1. And if you can guess what the purpose of this move is in 10 seconds or less, I'm a bit jealous. So the point is, if black plays rook to d8, you can defend d3 with the king from e2. That way, upon rook to d5, hitting white's knight with two pieces, white can simply move the knight. c6 is apparently the best square. When the d-pawn is defended, and queen to b8 check is on the cards. So that's what engine perfect play looks like from white, but now let's take a look at the way Hans handled the situation with his move rook to g2, which is cosmetically pleasing, but after rook to d8 from Yağız, Hans sees that rook to d5 is coming, his knight will have to move, and so d3 will need protection. So Hans decides to defend with queen to e4. But in this position, if Yağız were to play rook to d5, which he didn't, then once this knight moves, then unlike the other line we looked at, white doesn't have that nice activity with queen to b8 check. And I gotta confess, it's kind of hard to understand why the engine thinks that this position is so bad for white. It's giving almost 2 pawns in black's favor, even though he only has 1 extra pawn. All I can say is that there's pressure on d3, black's pieces are centrally placed, his king's a bit safer, so there seems to just be a lot of little things contributing to white's lost position here. And there are, of course, specific sequences of moves we could get into to try to demonstrate that. But I want to press on with the move played by Yağız after Hans played his queen to e4, and that is knight to h4, which is not the most accurate move, but it does get marks for aggression. He's attacking the rook, so what Hans should now play is rook to f2, followed by king to f1, after which the king e2 idea might still be good, depending on how black responds. And black will still be the favored side no matter what, having that extra pawn. But instead of playing rook to f2, which was absolutely essential, Hans goes for one of the most dangerous types of moves you can make, the counterattack with knight to g4, attacking the black queen. Now the thing about counterattacking is this. You better make sure it works, because if your opponent is able to move his attacked piece to a square where it threatens something new, like Yağız did here with queen to g5, the result will be that your opponent is threatening 2 things and you are threatening 0, which is exactly what happened here. So let's see what this move queen to g5 did. Well, one thing it did was allow queen takes e6 with check, now played by Hans. Might as well grab that pawn, and then after king to h8, now it's time to decide how to deal with the attack on the rook on g2. Now Hans would love to play rook to g3, but he doesn't because he can see that after queen to c1 check, his king can only go to f2, after which black has the crushing rook to f8 with check. When the white king is extremely short on squares, he's only got e2, the mating net is being woven. Next is queen takes b2 check, with the engine declaring a forced mate in 15. And it's not hard to believe. And even if it were, I don't question chess engines anymore. I stopped doing that back in the late 90s. But let's take a look at what Hans played in this position, which is rook to f2. It's probably his best try, though still totally hopeless, if that makes any sense. The problem with this move is that it leaves only the white knight standing between the black queen and the white king, which of course means that this knight is pinned. And so after h5, now played by Yağız, that knight is doomed. Hans plays h3, at least he's going to get a pawn out of it. After h takes g4, he's got h takes g4, giving him now 1 extra pawn for the lost piece, but only for a moment, since rook takes d3 is now possible. Yağız didn't play it though. I think maybe he was concerned about rook to f8 check, followed by queen to g8 check, which, although very scary looking, actually wouldn't have saved white's game. But the move Yağız played, queen to g6, is also winning, hitting d3 now with 2 pieces. Hans now plays for some last minute tricks with queen to c4, desperately hoping that Yağız will blunder with queen takes d3, which would epically fail to rook to f8 check. A wonderful tactical pattern to burn into your psyche. Of course, if the rook takes on f8, the black queen is lost. And if king to h7, there's this very nice line, queen to g8 check. If king to g6, then queen to f7 will mate in 2. So after king to h6, there's queen to h8 check. And here, king to g6 would run into queen to h5, checkmate. So queen to h7 is forced, but now bye-bye rook on d8, and black is finished. But Yağız is not about to fall for something like that, which is why in this position he simply plays rook to e8, looking to infiltrate to e1. Hans now sees an opportunity to pin Yağız's knight with rook to h2. Why not? At this point, an easily refuted one-move threat is probably black's best hope. So what does Yağız do? Of course, he easily refutes it, with a move that the engine says forces a checkmate in 14 moves at most, with queen to g5, threatening to come into c1 with check. Best defense for white is to play rook to f2, so that the king can hide on h2, but then after rook to e1 check, king to h2, black will move his knight off of the h-file, threatening queen to h4 check, and mate is drawing nigh. But Hans made life significantly easier for Yağız with the move he played in the game, queen to f7. Why he played it, I don't really know. All I can say is desperate people do desperate things, like making one-move threats. And here, rook to e1 check leads to the quickest mate in 5 moves, but Yağız begins with queen to c1 check, which would allow Hans to struggle on for a bit if he were to block with queen to f1, which is still hopelessly losing, but Hans instead plays king to f2. And now, if you'd like to try to spot the final move of the game, go ahead, give yourself 5 seconds or so. Hopefully it won't take you much longer than that. I think most of you will recognize pretty quickly that we have a mate in 1 here with queen to e1 checkmate. So, I hope you enjoyed this beautiful and instructive checkmating of one of the most interesting and controversial characters in the chess world, Hans Niemann, taken down by one of the greatest chess prodigies of modern times, or perhaps of all times, Yağız Kaan Erdoğmuş. Tell me what you think of this young genius in the comments, and thank you so much for watching this video until the very end. It's one of the best things you can do to support the channel, along with hitting that like button and subscribing if you want to see more content like this on the regular, and I will see you very soon.